Good morning and welcome to the 33rd meeting in 2024 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. The first item on our agenda today is to take evidence from representatives from the Office for Budget Responsibility in relation to the UK economic and fiscal outlook to inform our scrutiny of the Scottish Budget 2025-26. I'm delighted to say that we are joined today in person by Richard Hughes, OBR Chair, and Professor David Mills, CBE, and Tom Josephs, who are both members of the OBR's Budget Responsibility. And I first want to thank you all for taking the time and the trouble to come all the way up here. It's very much appreciated. So I'd like to welcome you all to the meeting and invite Mr Hughes to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for the invitation to be before you this morning. This forecast was done against the backdrop of a largely unchanged macroeconomic and sort of pre-measures macroeconomic and fiscal position compared to the forecast we did back in March. It was a sort of rare period of stability over a 6-month period between our forecasts, but it was obviously a budget full of very significant policy changes compared to the picture we painted when we did the economic and fiscal outlook back in March of this year. There was a very substantial increase in public spending of about 2% of GDP per year, or about £70 billion over the 5-year forecast, in each year of the 5-year forecast period. About 2/3 of that extra public spending went on current spending. About 1/3 of it went on extra capital spending. It took the size of will take the size of the UK states to 44% of GDP by the end of the decade, about 5 percentage points higher than it was before the pandemic. About half of that 2% of GDP increase in spending was funded by an increase in taxes, raising about £35 billion per year over the next 5 years. About half of that came from the rise in employer national insurance contributions, and half from a range of other taxes. And it would take the tax burden in the UK by the end of the decade up to 38% of GDP, its highest level on record. The other half of that increase in spending was funded by extra borrowing, again around £35 billion a year, or 1% of GDP, which in effect slows the pace of fiscal consolidation compared to the previous government's plans, and means it takes longer to get borrowing back to what would be seen to be a sort of debt stabilising level. In terms of its macroeconomic effect, we think that because there is a net fiscal loosening in this budget, because spending rises by more than taxation, that provides a temporary boost to output this year and next. But then that fades over the rest of the forecast period and leaves the level of GDP more or less unchanged by the time we get to the end of the decade compared to our March forecast. The budget also included a new set of fiscal rules for the UK government, one to balance the current budget, so balance day-to-day spending against revenue by the end of the decade. The Chancellor meets that with about £10 billion of headroom left to spare. And the second was a new fiscal rule and something of a novelty in fiscal policy making, both in the UK and in the world, and that is to get the government's financial balance sheet, or what's known as net financial liabilities, falling as a share of GDP by the end of the decade. And that rule is also met by a margin of around £16 billion. But both of those numbers are small fractions of the potential risks and pressures to the fiscal outlook. And so the Chancellor's continued the practice of previous Chancellors of setting aside relatively small amounts of headroom against her fiscal targets, given the risks that she might face over the coming 5 years.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. In time-honoured fashion, I'll start off with some questions and then we'll open up to colleagues around the table. So, first of all, I think in terms of you, when we look at the devolved tax and spending forecast document that you produced to go with this magnificent 207-page tome on the budget itself, you talk about the difference between there seems to be an element of frustration coming through about you say we lack sufficiently detailed or timely data that is required to produce forecasts for Scotland. So there's a lot of extrapolation in terms of what you're doing at the OBR. So I'm just wondering what additional data could be provided that would help you to make those forecasts more accurate. And I'm well aware, of course, that we do have a Scottish Fiscal Commission, and I'll ask you a question in relation to that in a minute or two.
Tom, should we come in?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I wouldn't say that we feel frustration, actually. I think what we described in the document is the different methodology that we use to produce the Scottish tax forecasts compared to the UK-wide forecasts. And the different approach we take is essentially that because we don't produce a macroeconomic forecast for Scotland, we use our UK-wide macroeconomic forecast and then essentially estimate to produce a UK-wide forecast for the relevant parts of income tax and the other devolved taxes, and then we use outturn information to estimate the Scottish share of those receipts. We do actually now have good outturn data, I would say, for the property taxes and landfill taxes that are fully devolved. We do face some challenges on the income tax side because the way in which the income tax is measured is on a liabilities basis, and we do have quite a long lag before we get the outturn data on income tax on that liabilities basis. So that does require us on the income tax forecast to do quite a lot of extrapolation from outturn data. The most recent forecast, we were able to use 2022-23 outturn data for liabilities, so it is a few years ago. We can then build on that with more recent outturn data on income tax in particular, using HMRC's more recent data sources, but that doesn't provide the complete picture of the whole of the non-savings, non-dividend income, which is devolved to Scotland. We are trying to develop this. We work very closely with both the Scottish Fiscal Commission, with HMRC and with the Scottish Government to try and ensure that we are continually developing our forecast methodologies. We've done some more in-depth analysis of the drivers, in particular of the income tax forecast, in order to allow us to do that. And we produced quite a lengthy paper on that, looking at some of those drivers last year. So yeah, I wouldn't say we feel too frustrated. As I say, we do have to take a different approach for Scotland. We do have a lot of good data that we can use to produce the forecast, and we are working with our stakeholders to try and develop that over time.
The issue of outturn data for income tax, which is also mentioned in your report, of course, Amy, would you like to, if there was an improvement in data, like to see that timescale truncated somewhat, or do you think that's unlikely due to the way it's set up?
Yes, so the natural lags in the payment of self-assessment mean that it's not possible to get more up-to-date outturn information on the non-savings, non-dividend income tax on the liabilities basis. Yeah. But as I say, what we can do is develop the other sources of outturn data that we use to sort of build the picture on top of that lagged outturn. Right. So we have been using more of the more up-to-date HMRC real-time information, which covers PAYE, for example, and using that to develop the forecast. And I think there's more we can do on that side to supplement the forecast.
Now, interestingly, I notice that your forecasts appear to be more optimistic than those of the SFC. I'm just wondering, historically, where are you in terms of accuracy compared to the SFC with their predictions? I mean, are you more accurate, less accurate, more or less on the nose, give or take?
Yeah.
What are the margins?
Just a couple of things on that. I mean, one thing to say is that the SFC's last forecast was produced some time ago now. So it's difficult to compare forecasts, our current forecast with their previous one. As you know, they will be updating their forecast very soon. And it is the case that we've faced a lot of volatility in the economy and the public finances over the last few years. So just the natural gap in timing between forecasts.
Bob, you should be in diplomacy, actually. You should be. I mean, somehow I had the feeling you were going to talk about the timing of the forecast. But anyway, it was worth a try, wasn't it?
There has been some analysis of forecast errors or forecast differences, where I think there was not a huge difference between the average forecast differences between ourselves and the SFC over time.
One of the things, if we look at your Scottish report, there's a couple of issues you touch on, your passenger duty and about the final timing of that. Another thing is VAT assignment. I mean, to this committee, that's the kind of dog that just won't die. I mean, we've made it clear as a committee to the Scottish Government that we think that it might have been in the Smith Commission report, but we don't see that there's any advantage whatsoever to an assignment of VAT. We could possibly have an argument about whether it should be devolved or not, but certainly on assignment. And in your report in section 8, you've said the formal methodology of a VAT assignment has been developed by HMRC, the Treasury and the Scottish Government. Is there any point in progressing with that any further? We don't see that there is.
Well, so I mean, we do not have a role in the policy decisions
Indeed.
around devolved tax, so that's not something we're involved in, and I'm afraid that I'm really able to comment on. As you can see, we prepare forecasts so that if agreement is reached on that, we would be able to produce a forecast. But yeah, as I say, we're not involved in the policy discussions on that.
Okay. Now, Mr. Hughes, in terms of your report and what you've said is, and I'm going to quote a lot from your report. Everything I'm going to say more or less is going to be quoted from your report. You've said, right at the start on page 7, budget policies from the recent budget leave the level of output broadly unchanged at the forecast horizon. And you go on to say that real household disposable income per person, a measure of living standards, will grow by an average of just over 0.5% a year over the forecast. And compared to a March forecast, the level per person is just over 2% higher at the start of the forecast due to data revisions, but 1.25% lower by the start of 2029. The bulk of this difference, around 85%, is explained by policies announced in this budget. So I'm just wondering if your view is that Scotland will follow that same trajectory, and why you feel that and a lot of the budget detail that you've analysed seems to be on the same theme, that a lot of it is being front-loaded with a kind of reduction in terms of issues like growth and investment over the piece. So I'm just wondering if you can talk us through that particular issue in terms of disposable income.
Sure. And David will almost certainly want to come in on the precise mechanics of this, but I guess our expectation would be, and it will be interesting to see what the SFC have in their forecast, is that the same forces that will be weighing on real earnings growth in England will also do the same in Scotland, because much of the slowdown in real earnings growth and in household disposable income over the next 2 years is driven by the fact that we think that the bulk of the incidence of the employer national insurance rises will ultimately fall on the real wages of employees. And so a big part of what is weighing on real earnings growth in 2025 and 2026 is passing on that increase in payroll costs from the employer in the form of lower real wage growth for the employee. And I don't know, David, you want to say a bit more about how that works?
Yeah, so there's a big increase in taxes in the budget, and in the short run, the biggest effect really will be on corporate wage bills and profits, because it's very difficult for companies who have to pay the national insurance themselves at the higher rate to pass that on to the workforce. They can't just announce they're going to cut wages. There are contracts and they can't do that. Over the longer term, it seems quite plausible that much of the effect of that tax actually does get passed back on to the workforce in the form of slightly lower wage settlements than otherwise would have happened. We estimate that something like 3/4 of the, ultimately in the longer term, 3/4 of the impact of the substantial increase in taxes actually gets paid by the workforce, and the other quarter will impinge a bit on corporate profits. And the numbers are sufficiently big that that's one of the factors why, by the end of the forecast horizon, although in the short term there's a bit of a boost to household disposable income, a lot of that gets eroded by the time you got to the end of the forecast, because somebody's got to pay this tax. And ultimately, there's quite a lot of evidence that most of it will fall back on the workforce. So you get, in the short term, a bit of a boost, partly because the increase in government spending is a bit front-loaded. So you just get a sort of what you might call a positive effect from the increase in demand in the economy. That's then offset a bit over time by partly the results of the tax increase. And we also think that as a result of the budget, interest rates are a bit higher over the next few years than they otherwise would have been. And it's a combination of those factors which mean that you end up with not very strong real income growth for the workforce and for households by the time you get to the end of the forecast. Having said that, and partly related perhaps to your previous question about the OBR having been a bit optimistic in the past sometimes about the growth of the economy in general and household real income growth, we're still probably on the optimistic side of most people on the rate of productivity growth in the UK, which is ultimately the driver of real income growth. We've been a bit more optimistic than most over the last few years and have erred on the side of being too optimistic. But we've kind of taken the view that the most likely outcome for the next 5 years for Britain as a whole and for Scotland is that outcomes are not as bad as the truly dismal last 15 years. In the last 15 years since the financial crisis, you go back to 2009, and yeah, it's pretty much 15 years now. In that period, productivity growth in the UK has barely been 0.5%. In the 30, 40, 50 years before the financial crisis, it was 2.5%. So we've kind of lost, relative to what people would have expected 15 years ago, if you'd asked them, where will the UK be, where will average earnings be, total GDP be 15 years down the road in 2024, right now the level of GDP is probably 30% lower. We've lost 2% growth a year for 15 years. And the view we take at the OBR is that the next 10 or 15 years, we'd be very unfortunate. I mean, it might happen, but it would be very unfortunate if the next 5, 10 years were as bad as a pretty catastrophic 15 years in terms of overall growth of GDP. So that's why our forecasts are a little more optimistic than most others who sort of take the view, well, now having had more or less 15 years of low growth, that's the new normal for the UK. So despite a lot of people think the OBR is always pessimistic, but I think we've actually been on the slightly optimistic side of many.
I have to say, it doesn't read particularly optimistically when you say that in page 53, for example, that this results in an average annual increase in tax in excess of £800 per employee, and you talk about how, for example, real private consumption is forecast to fall 0.4 percentage points as a share of GDP from 23 to 29. In pre-measures forecast, we expected this to rise by 0.4%, but this is more than offset by policy measures in the budget.
What's happened is that relative to the previous government's plans, which were really to see public spending fall fairly steadily and significantly as a percentage of GDP over the next 5 years, the budget that we saw a couple of weeks back is one, as Richard was saying, in which public spending actually rises fairly substantially relative to the previous plans by about 70 billion, 2% of GDP a year for the foreseeable future, certainly for the next 5 years or so. And in a sense, what's happening, and a good chunk of that is financed through higher taxes. So there's a kind of switch in resources in a way, away from private consumption toward government spending. And it's that holds back what otherwise would have been a kind of stronger growth in household disposable incomes. It's pretty much impossible to raise taxes very substantially without ultimately that all flowing back to less disposable income for households. And that's really what's the story of the budget.
I mean, you said, again, in your report that the outlook for productivity growth remains the most important and uncertain forecast judgment. You did actually touch on that. You go on to talk about the effects of subdued investment, the energy price shock and Brexit compound the ongoing weakness seen since the financial crisis. Now, obviously, productivity growth is great concern to this committee. We've raised it on numerous occasions, numerous different fora with different people. But where do you see the way in which we can try and break the productivity bottleneck? You've also raised concerns about the number of people who are economically inactive, and there are more people economically inactive in Scotland than there are in the UK as a percentage now. Do you see that the way to break productivity is through technology and migration? And what impact is demography, the ageing of the indigenous population, for if you want to put it that way, the people who live here already, impacting against productivity? So you've got migration and you've got technological advance, one would think, improving productivity, but then you've got an ageing population kind of creating a drag on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. Those are the two big offsetting factors. In the long run, the story of why we're so much better off materially than people were 100, 200, 300 years ago is just because of technological progress. You discover better ways of doing things, and you can see it, just looking around one. And that's a big positive driver over the long run. It seems to have stalled over the last decade or so, not just in the UK, but probably in most advanced, rich economies in the world. Productivity growth has been pretty disappointing, perhaps a bit more disappointing in the UK than in most places. I think it would be pessimistic to think that we'd kind of run out of ideas. New technology comes along, things you can't predict, but nonetheless improve the standard of living. And maybe the latest of those is amazing developments in artificial intelligence, which perhaps are yet to roll out and actually affect how businesses and the public sector services are provided. But I think there's scope for some optimism about that. And that's partly on the back of why we take a view that the last 15 years may turn out in the long run to be an unusually bad period of productivity growth, which doesn't continue into the future. But you're also very much right that offsetting that in terms of generating total income for the economy, or GDP, are demographic trends and ageing of the population, which in the absence of large-scale net immigration would be now meaning and would continue to mean that the overall labour force and employment would probably be declining. So that's been offset in recent years by high net immigration into the UK, so much so that total employment actually hasn't fallen and has actually tended to increase a bit in recent years, even though the demographics, the purely demographic structure of the domestic population that's already here, would be pushing in the other direction. Quite how this will play out over the next 5 years and beyond, I think depends pretty sensitively on what happens to net immigration. We've taken the Office for National Statistics central projection, which is that the level of net immigration into the UK is very high in the historical sense, but is lower than it's been in the last couple of years, when it's been 600,000-700,000. And that falls back to something a bit above 300,000. And we take that as our central projection. But there's no great confidence that we have in that. It's just we have to make some assumption about what happens to net immigration. Obviously, that's a pretty large number of people arriving in the UK every year. It means that total employment doesn't decline, which it probably would in the absence of such large-scale immigration, just because of the demographics of the domestic population, people here already.
Okay, now you've said that in 2026 and 2027 we expect households to run down the rate of saving significantly as they try to maintain consumption growth in the face of stagnant real wages. And then you talk about a direct behavioural response to taxation, and that it will increase the incentive for more tax-motivated incorporations. And you estimate this will increase by a cumulative 17,000 by 29-30. As a result of the budget, and these combined effects reduce yield by £700 million by 29-30. How do you come to that estimation of tax-motivated incorporations? I mean, this is an issue we have in Scotland as well, of great concern because of the different tax rates we have here.
So that estimate is related to the increase in employer national insurance contributions that was announced at the budget. And we estimate with HMRC that the increase in those costs will increase the incentive for some people to switch from employment rather to incorporate. It's actually a relatively small effect compared to some other tax changes that we've seen in the past. It is to some degree offset. The impact is not as large as it might have been if we just have had a increase in the rate and the reduction in the threshold, because the government also increased the employment allowance, which is a reduction in national insurance liabilities that firms pay essentially for the first £10,500 worth of their liabilities. So for smaller businesses, that offsets quite a bit of the increase in the rate. And it is those smaller businesses where you might see more of this incentive to incorporate take place. So that has offset some of that effect, because that actually kind of reduces the incentive to incorporate.
Yeah, you've said that 250,000 employers gain from the budget, 940,000 lose out, and 820,000 see no change.
Yeah, that's right. So there are there are a large number of very small firms that will essentially benefit from that increase in the employment allowance. So they comprise the firms that either see roughly no change or actually benefit from the overall package.
Okay, now Scotland obviously is a disproportionate number of jobs in the North Sea with the oil and gas industry. And in page 67 of your report, you talk about the Energy Profits Levy. You say that overall, on average, we assume that over the forecast period, capital expenditure is 26% lower, oil production 6.3% lower, and gas production 9.2% lower compared to our March forecast, which is quite significant changes. What would be the impact on employment in that sector from that?
We have not made an estimate of the impact on employment.
That's what I'm asking, so can you find it in the document?
Yeah, so we have not made that estimate. For our analysis of the tax raised through the Energy Profits Levy and through North Sea oil production more generally, we don't need to do that calculation, so we haven't done it. I should say that reduction in both investment and production is based on analysis of the impact of the new announcements the government made in the budget on the energy profits levies, increasing the rate and extending
Yes, I appreciate it's over and above things like, for example, transition. Yeah.
Well, but it's also based on the fact that there has been clearly a change in the outlook in terms of the regulation of the sector. Mm-hmm. There are the legal cases that you'll be aware of. So all of that together was the basis for our assumption of the quite significant fall in investment and production compared to last time. Clearly, the sector in our baseline forecast was already on a declining path, and as you know, has been for some time. So these new policy announcements and the new policy framework generally has added to that.
Okay, and what you've said in nominal terms debt interest spending falls to 104.9 billion this year, but then increases year on year to 122.2 billion pounds by 29/30 in table 513, which is a 12.6 billion pound revision since March. I wonder if you can talk us through that.
It does, and I think this is our first forecast we've ever done where debt interest costs remain above 100 billion every year of the forecast, and it reflects two factors. One is that the government is borrowing significantly more every year over the next 5 years, and reflecting the fact that they've increased spending by more than they've increased taxation, and their fiscal rules allow them to borrow so long as they are investing in financial assets. And so they are no longer, unlike the previous Chancellor, committed to reducing the stock of debt as a share of GDP at any point in the forecast, excluding on the definition that the previous government used, which excludes the Bank of England. So on that measure, debt excluding the Bank of England rises as a share of GDP throughout the forecast up to the sort of mid-90s as a share of GDP. And so it's a combination of a rising debt stock as a share of the economy plus interest rates are a bit higher, both in our pre-measures forecast, but also we think that there is, as David mentioned, there would be a further rise in interest rates as a result of the government's policy measures. And indeed, we saw that market response shortly after the budget announcement that because there was this fiscal loosening and a bigger volume of gilt issuance expected, that pushed up the yield on government debt and also raised expectations for the level of bank rates going forward. So a shallower decline compared to what markets were expecting before. So it's both an increase in the volume of debt as well as an increase in the interest costs of servicing that debt, which pushes that up.
Okay, and you've said the probability of the target being met, the updated fiscal mandate, is 54%, which is almost a kind of... It's not very, it's a bit worrying, really, is it not?
Yeah, it's sort of just the right side of the line. And as I said, it continues a practice that we've seen of successive chances in recent years, which is to run the fiscal rules very, very hot and very close to the wire, and against a backdrop of what we have observed to be just a continually very volatile macroeconomic environment, both in the UK and around the world. And it would take just a further 0.3 percentage point increase in interest costs to wipe out that headroom on the current balance. And that is more or less what we've seen since March. So it doesn't take very much to wipe out that headroom altogether. And I think it's particularly binding on this Chancellor and this set of fiscal rules, because unlike the previous set of rules which kind of rolled forward every year, this Chancellor is committed to bringing their deadline forward to 3 years ahead. So she's got 2 years where the rule is not rolling forward a year, and she's buying herself a bit more breathing space by getting an extra year to get there. She's got 2 years where she just got this target moving toward her. It then becomes a rolling 3-year target once 2029-30 becomes 3 years ahead. But for the next 2 years, she's stuck with that as the deadline for getting the current budget into balance.
Yeah, so 0.3% wriggle room. Now, you've said on page 158 that the net impact of the policies announced at this budget is to reduce real business investment in the near term by 1.8%, or a cumulative £25 billion by the forecast horizon. And then you go on to say in the same page, if the tax to GDP ratio were to remain at its 2024-25 level, tax revenues would be 62.2 billion lower in 29-30 than you currently predict.
So the reduction in business investment is an artefact of the 2 points David mentioned. One is that we think, at least in the near term, it will be difficult for businesses to pass on the increase in the employer NICs rise onto lower real wages, because we're not expecting significant real wage cuts. But over time, you'll get less real wage growth. But in the near term, businesses have to find a 2% increase in payroll costs starting on the 1st of April. So some of that just comes out of profits and comes out of planned business investments in the near term. And then over the medium term, we think, because there's a significant fiscal loosening in this budget, that crowds out some business investment through pushing up financing costs for businesses and increasing their cost of capital. And so you get lower business investment, both because they need to find some cash in the near term to meet the next cost, and then over the medium term, they've got higher financing cost, which also crowds out some business investment.
Okay, thank you. I'm keen to continue to ask more questions, but I've got colleagues who are all champing at the bit to come in, so I shall desist. And the first person to ask questions will be Craig, to be followed by John.
Thank you, Convener. Just for some context, and welcome to the committee. You obviously are projecting that the size of the public spending as a percentage of GP is going to rise over the period, as is the percentage of tax take. How does that compare to equivalent Western economies at the moment?
So it brings us kind of closer to continental type economies in terms of the tax take as well as the size of the state. Basically, the US and Canada are below us, as are sort of Australia and New Zealand. They're sort of lower tax, smaller state. They're still at 44% for the level of public spending and 38% for taxation. We're still below countries like France, where you've actually got the tax burdens more than 50% of GDP these days. But it brings us kind of closer to our continental cousins, and I'd say further away from sort of North American or Antipodean countries in terms of the amount of income being taken out of people's pockets and the amount of money being spent on public services and welfare.
Obviously, you discussed earlier the sort of demographic trends in relation to the UK workforce. We have been dependent upon net inward migration for employment. Is there a risk as we close that gap that the UK would be seen as a less attractive place to come and live and work? And bearing in mind that in Scotland we have a particular issue, despite net inward migration into the UK, Scotland isn't realising its fair share, as it were, which is leading to imbalances in the labour and employment market here. Is there a risk that our dependency upon net inward migration could be impeded by or undermined by this closure in the gap?
It may be. I suppose I'd say at the moment government policy is to reduce net migration, so they may see it as a facilitator rather than necessarily a problem from a net migration point of view. But it's certainly your expected level of disposable income is one of the reasons why you might move from one country to another if you're somebody moving somewhere to work. What we've seen recently in the pattern of net migration is that more of it has been coming from emerging market countries rather than developed economies, and that's partly reflecting the change in migration regime and other things. But about half of our net migration used to come from European Union countries. Nowadays, nearly all of our net migration comes from the rest of the world, not from Europe. But from countries in South Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa, and that probably reflects the fact that the income differential you can get from coming to the UK and working is significantly higher if you're coming from those countries than had you come from countries in Europe, and probably also reflecting kind of other factors that feed into people's employment decisions. Tom?
Just to add quickly on that, so there were a couple of tax policy measures in the budget where we did make a specific assessment of whether it would have an impact on migration. Those were the measures on non-domiciles and on carried interest, which is the tax paid by some fund management executives. And we made a specific assessment there because those groups of taxpayers are very, high net income individuals, tend to be very mobile. Many of them are actually foreign nationals. So in that case, we did make an assumption that the non-domicile changes would increase migration within that group by around 10 to 20%. And we also made an assumption there would be some migration amongst carried interest taxpayers. But these are relatively small population groups. So we don't assume that has a kind of wider macroeconomic impact on the UK economy.
Yeah, okay. And just in terms of the labour market and the level of inactivity within the labour market, how concerned should we be about that position across the whole of the UK, and specifically in Scotland, where it is higher as a percentage of the population?
So I think very concerned. It's certainly one of the most striking features of the post-pandemic economy has been this fall in the employment rate and rise in the number of people classes inactive. Now, there is an important debate going on about the shortcomings in the labour market data that are currently being produced, and there's been some interesting work looking at. You may arrive at different estimates by using different methods for trying to measure the number of people who consider themselves to be inactive. But there's no doubt that the number of people who are on sickness-related benefits is rising significantly, and awards to those people are rising significantly. So even if the labour market data is giving us possibly a misleading signal, the data coming out of the welfare system is giving you a pretty clear indication that the case numbers are rising and awards are rising, and so it is that is sufficient reason for alarm, just for fiscal reasons, even if you think that the numbers in the labour market might be different. And the trends, if they carry on, do become very significant. And because if somebody falls out of the labour force, in particular for health reasons, which seems to be one of the biggest recent drivers, you have to worry about it from a fiscal point of view for three reasons. You lose the tax revenue from them that you would have had from them if they were working. Oftentimes they are on inactive benefits, and so they're a cost to the welfare system. And then also if they need long-term health care from the health service, that's a further pressure on public services. And so there are huge fiscal dividends from keeping people healthy, keeping them in employment, so that they're earning money, they're paying tax, they're not increasing welfare costs, and they're not putting pressures on the health service. We did some work over the summer in our fiscal risks and sustainability report looking at what the potential fiscal dividends could be if you can get onto a sort of better health trajectory. And over the long term, the payoffs are huge. Probably one of the biggest differences you can make to the long-run trajectory of UK debt is if you can keep more people healthy and in employment for longer, and that can reduce the sort of rise in debt that you would otherwise see by up to 40% of GDP by the end of a 50-year period. So it's one of the single biggest things you can do to kind of shift the dial on fiscal sustainability.
And obviously, in terms of the UK government, we're hearing about their prospectus today in relation to welfare and employment. How concerned in Scotland should we be by the fact that we have a higher percentage of people going into long-term disability benefits, and that the trend growth seems to be faster, that percentage is rising faster? I mean, that presumably should be a concern for any government.
Yeah, I think it's a problem. It's a concern both sides of the border, and it seems to be an issue which we face kind of nationwide. It's not confined to a particular region in the country. Some bits of the country have it worse than others, but it seems to be a common pattern across the regions and nations of the UK.
And post-pandemic, if you look at the active labour market, obviously there is a sense that people are retiring earlier in many respects, sometimes in relation to pensions legislation, and that others are perhaps just not working quite as hard as they did pre-pandemic. How, in public policy terms, do you seek to reverse that?
David, do you want to go with that?
I think it's difficult, and in fact, to the extent that the national insurance measure in the budget will ultimately largely get passed back to the workforce, it pushes slightly in the wrong direction, because it's effectively a tax on labour supply, and that doesn't help the trends that you mention. And it comes on top of what we were talking about a moment ago, which is this very substantial rise in the proportion of people who are inactive due to long-term sickness. I think one of the very difficult issues to work out on that issue, if I may briefly, is to what extent is it a reflection of a real deterioration in the health of the population in the UK, and to what extent is it something else going on, which is a really significant difference now between the level of benefits you would receive if you were judged to be so unwell as to not be able to look for work. The highest level of benefit now relative to unemployment benefit is really very large, and the conditionality on receipt of sickness benefit, I think, is much lower than the conditionality on unemployment benefit, where really you have to essentially show that you're more or less full-time looking for work, and if you can't do that, then your benefits will be cut, and there isn't that level of ongoing scrutiny, if you like, or conditionality for people who are on sickness benefits relative to unemployment benefits. The balance between how much of the big rise in people inactive due to long-term sickness is due to real deterioration in health, and how much is due to the incentives that the welfare system gives, I think is formidably difficult to work out. But I mean, potentially has a very big impact if you could change the trajectory of inactivity, as Richard was saying. It's a big driver of the big increase in the welfare bill.
And is this a UK Scottish problem, or are we seeing similar trends in equivalent economies?
It's most pronounced in the UK, which is one of the reasons why some people have started to look harder at the data. But it's a trend you've seen in some other countries, but we seem to have it the worst of OECD countries. But Tom, do you want to say something?
Yes, so one interesting thing is that in the 2010s, the UK actually performed very well in terms of inactivity compared to other countries. We saw falling rates of inactivity compared to many other of the advanced economies. But what seems to have happened in the UK is that we had an increase in inactivity, in particular due to health-related reasons during the pandemic. You also saw that in a lot of other countries for obvious reasons. But in other countries, it seemed to reverse very quickly after COVID, whereas in the UK, the trend has been maintained and actually increased. So that is a bit of a puzzle as to why that's happened in the UK, but you haven't seen that in other countries. We actually did a study of this, which we published in September, which covered many of the issues that David was talking about, and looked at trends in incapacity benefits over the past 40 years. And you can see at different times, there seem to be different drivers. There's a driver from the underlying health of the population. There's a driver from the performance of the economy and the labour market in particular. And there's also then factors around the structure of the benefit system that David was talking about. But it is very difficult to disentangle exactly which of those drivers is having the biggest effect at any one time. But it's certainly a very important issue, and one which more research on, I think, would be extremely useful, trying to get to the bottom of.
Yeah, thank you. And I labour that point in relation to the questions because I think it is a concern of the committee, because it lies at the heart of the problem that we've got within the Scottish budget. Just looking at the measures that were introduced by the UK government in relation to targeting the overspend, a number of savings that were put in place, or potential savings in July, which included departments absorbing at least £3.2 billion public sector pay, immediate action to stop all non-essential government consultancy spend, and a 2% saving against government administration budgets. The UK government have said that process is ongoing. How confident are you that they could realise that set of potential savings? And are you seeing anything like the equivalent determination within the Scottish government to look at implementing those kinds of efficiency savings within expenditure?
I suppose the government announced those sorts of savings, so it remains to be seen whether they get delivered over the rest of the year. One thing I'd say is that they've sort of been overridden by the fact the government has also just announced an extra more than £20 billion more for all government departments. So to some extent, I think the financial pressure on departments to deliver those savings as a way of meeting their budget totals, I think, has been substantially alleviated for a lot of departments. There are also relatively modest measures compared to the increases that they're getting. So I suppose in that sense, probably for a lot of departments, the financial incentives to deliver those things as a way of sticking within your budget and not getting a rap over the knuckles from the Public Accounts Committee at the end of the year, I think is significantly alleviated. And because for a lot of departments, their budgets are just a kind of massive spending, it can be difficult to identify exactly how many savings are realised within one proportion of it, because ultimately they've got a single budget they prioritise within it, and most of those budgets are going up very significantly this year. They're growing by more than 4% in real terms, which is growth rates in public services spending we haven't seen for English departments in a number of years.
Doesn't that go to the heart of the problem, however? Basically, you're looking at living standards going up on average by 0.5% a year. You're looking at tax rising, but yet some of that granular work that could be done by government to reduce government expenditure just gets washed out when there's a great splurge of cash that comes in, which is largely through borrowing and tax.
I guess the big real increases happen this year and next. So departmental spending is growing by 4.8% this year, 3.1% in real terms next year, but then it slows quite significantly over the remainder of the Parliament, down to 1.3% in real terms per year. And so to deliver that kind of tight spending envelope, which the government and the Chancellor said that they are now committed to, is going to require some pretty tough prioritisation and almost certainly significant savings to be found somewhere within the mass of departmental spending. If that kind of slowdown in spending growth is going to be stuck to, given what we know about spending pressures in some particular services. We know there's lots of pressures in the health service. We know there are pressures to increase defence spending. So what that means for other services is probably actually some quite tough spending settlements, which will demand substantial efficiencies and substantial savings if they're going to be doing any kind of new activity in the second half of the Parliament.
But presumably that work should begin now. They shouldn't be negligent in relation to that. They should do it with gusto and determination.
I guess you'd hope that would be an important part of the current multi-year spending round conversations going on within governments, which are expected to come to a conclusion in spring of next year.
Just in relation to the impact of national insurance on the public sector, this is obviously something that's quite topical here in Scotland at the moment, because there appears to be a potential dispute between the UK government and the Scottish government in relation to the Barnett consequentials that are coming forward. So the Scottish government say they require 500 million, the UK government are presently giving 300 million. How accurate or robust do you reckon either of those sets of figures are? How easy is it to actually project what the equivalent would be for Scotland on the back of the national insurance increase, specific in relation to the public sector jobs?
Both of those numbers come from the Westminster government and the Scottish government, so we don't doubt the validity of their claims. As we understand it, the 300 million being provided to Scotland is just the Barnett consequentials on the compensation being provided to public servants in England. And that is not provided, and even in England and Wales, that's not being provided to all people on the public payroll. It's just people who are classed within the public sector as employees.
And just in relation to your assessment of the UK tax take, etc. The convener identified that obviously you do have some issues in relation to making those projections. In Scotland, there is this, more recently, there's this principle of Scottish exceptionalism, which is we do things differently and we create new bodies to do things differently. Would there be a case for the Scottish Fiscal Commission being brought into the Office for Budget Responsibility so you could work seamlessly together in order to get a more accurate picture on the state of Scotland's finances?
I think competition and contestability is a good thing in forecasting. I mean, we're not the only forecaster in macroeconomic forecaster in the UK, and we look a lot at the Bank of England's forecasts. We look at those produced by institutes like the National Institute for Economic and Social Research. We have very good and lively discussions with the SFC about our forecast methodologies. And I think in terms of methodology, I think basically share on nearly everything we do in common. As Tom was saying, usually the biggest difference between our forecasts and the SFC's forecasts just comes down to timing. And because the Scottish budget does happen at a different time from budgeting in Westminster, it does just make sense to have the most up-to-date outlook. And because there are different interests on this committee's part and on the Scottish Government's part to know different things about public spending, they focus a lot more on what happens within public services spending than we have traditionally done in Westminster. We focus more on tax and welfare. I think it's good to get the kind of service you want from the SFC here in Scotland. And we do have, I think, very good and ongoing discussions with them about methodologies. And where we do differ, we do our best to explain why. And as I said, it's usually mostly down to just what data is available to different forecasts at different points.
Thank you. And just finally, and briefly, one of the problems we had in the Scottish budget last year was the inability to project public sector pay, which led the Scottish Fiscal Commission to come up with one figure which in the end was not reflective of the higher figure that fed through. What more do you think we should be doing in Scotland to make sure that the public sector pay levels are a matter for the government and the trade unions, but what more should we be doing to make sure we properly project for public sector pay so that our forecasts are robust and we don't end up with these very large in-year revisions?
So we've also not been satisfied with the information that we got out of the Westminster government about public sector pay, and up until this EFO, but it has changed in this EFO. We didn't used to have a sort of separate published projection for the pay bill within departmental spending. We just assumed that somehow whatever the government's pay policies were, they would get absorbed within the overall envelope for departmental spending. We have now, as part of recommendation of a review we did to our forecasting methodology for departmental spending, now insisted that the government provide us with a projection for the total public sector pay bill. Now, within that, you've obviously got an assumption about numbers of people and then an assumption about pay growth. It's still the case that I think in both Westminster and in Holyrood, there is a certain amount of vagueness you have to cope with about what public sector pay policy actually is, sometimes within the current year, and almost certainly beyond the current year. And as forecasters, we would obviously like more information about what assumptions are you making about public sector pay growth in order to assess the sustainability and realism of those forecasts. At the very least now, we've got some articulation about what the total pay bill looks like as an assumption within total departmental spending, so you can see whether it's squeezing out other elements of departmental expenditure. What we haven't managed to get the Westminster government to do is to give us a sort of multi-year pay strategy with sort of pay growth assumptions and numbers underpinning that. They would argue at the moment they haven't done a spending review, so we couldn't tell you how many doctors, nurses, teachers they're going to be within that. And you'd need that as a starting point to then think about how much you'd pay them. Once you've got that plan, we'll ask some more questions about how much each group is likely to be paid.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I'm sure the SFC will be relieved that there's not going to be any hostile takeover from the OBR. Okay, John to be followed by Ross. John to be followed by Liz. Sorry.
Thanks very much, Convener. Going back to some of the issues we've talked about already, especially the national insurance increase. Now, you've put quite a big emphasis, as I understand it, on the fact that profits will be squeezed, wages in future years will come down, perhaps, and maybe jobs might be reduced. But you don't seem to put so much emphasis on the idea that prices would just increase. And, I mean, if I was running a restaurant and charging £17 for a main course, why wouldn't I just put 50 pence or a pound onto the main course? And I mean, some restaurant people have told me that that's just what they do.
David?
Yeah, I think it's tricky to work out how much might come through granting lower wage settlements than otherwise they would, and how much comes through prices. I mean, in one sense, it doesn't matter how the pain comes through to households, because what matters is the real purchasing power of their wages. So whether you get kind of lower wages but less inflation, or higher money wages but it's eroded by higher prices, in some sense it still does the same thing to people's real disposable income and also their incentives to work, because it's the real wage you get per hour. We've kind of skewed it a bit toward companies getting the money back, in a sense, by giving people wage settlements of, maybe 2.5% instead of 3 or 3.5%. And you do that for a couple of years, and you've got most of the tax shifted onto the workforce. You're right; it could come through more in higher prices than in lower wages, and in a way, you could do that more quickly. Obviously, what you can't do as an employer is say to the workforce, from Monday, you're getting a 2.5% wage cut. But they could, absolutely. So they could put the prices up by 2.5% on Monday. And most of the workers, who spend most of their money on things not sold in the shop or the restaurant or wherever, will say, oh, OK, that's no skin off my nose. Except, of course, if everybody does it, then the general level of prices goes up. And so workers don't avoid it that way. And you're right. I mean, it could play out that it's more about price increases, and that comes through a bit more quickly. If that happens, then our inflation forecast is going to be a bit on the optimistic side, and maybe also our forecast about the interest rate set by the Bank of England will be a bit on the optimistic side, because they're not going to sit and watch inflation move up to 3.5% or 4% in the UK and say, well, that'll blow over. And the reason I think they can't afford to do that is partly because of what happened a couple of years ago. Inflation got up to 10% or so in the UK. And so the Bank of England is probably unusually sensitive to inflation overshoots now, in a way that it might have been more willing to wait and see a bit had it not been for the sort of 10% inflation at just not much more than a year ago now. So I think you're right. I mean, it's a risk that there's more of an inflation impact, and that's how it comes through.
OK, that's helpful, thank you. On a different subject, I'm still trying to get my head around these letters, but PSNFL, is that right? Public Sector Net Financial Liabilities. Could you just explain a little bit this to me? I mean, I get the fact that when you're borrowing, if I was borrowing a mortgage, then you look at your asset, the house or whatever, and the two go together. So in a sense, it does make sense to include the financial assets, but we're not including the physical assets, because I would have thought, it's slightly different borrowing money to build a road or a house or a school than borrowing to pay for teachers or nurses or resource spending. So can you explain just where the logic is in here as to why this measure is being used?
It's probably more for the government to explain the logic of its fiscal targets, but we can certainly talk about its sort of features and properties and risks. What it does is, traditionally, what we've targeted as the stock variable in fiscal rules has been public sector net debt, which did net off some things. The net was in there for a reason, but it only netted off the cash holdings of government, which was in essence its foreign exchange reserves. And its principle was basically that if government experienced acute sort of financial problems, the cash that it has on hand is probably available to pay down some of its debt or to meet some of its financial obligations. And so if it found itself in some kind of acute liquidity shock, net debt was a reasonable measure of the government's ability to cope with that, because it's got some cash on hand and it's got some debt to service on the other side of the balance sheet. Public sector net financial liabilities broadens the definition of assets and liabilities captured within and netted off against each other, to include, on the liability side, not just debt, but also the liabilities of funded pension schemes. So other things which look more like direct financial obligations, but not just to creditors, but also to essentially local government employees who have funded pension rights. But then on the asset side, takes account of the fact that government also has financial assets which earn it a financial return, which could help meet the cost of those liabilities over the longer term. So it's less of a kind of liquidity measure and more of a kind of financial solvency measure. And on the asset side of the government balance sheet, You have a sort of small number of loans and equity holdings that government has. The single largest element of the asset side of the portfolio is the student loan book. So students who take out loans to go to university pay those back at an interest rate. And that generates a financial return for government, which it can meet its financial liabilities in the form of gilts and in the form of these other financial obligations. You know, what it doesn't do, as you say, is further expand it to include on the asset side physical assets. And I guess if you wanted to explain why not, I mean, you could sort of argue that those assets don't generate a direct financial return to government. They might, you might think that they would deliver an economic return in the long run, which would generate some potential output and then some tax revenues. But unlike a loan, which you have to pay me back, it's not helping me directly by extending it to you. And so it would be a more risky proposition to borrow for that kind of investment because its financial return is less certain than having a loan which has got a principal amount and an interest rate and a maturity date.
Okay, I mean, that's helpful. But it does mean that we're treating borrowing the same, whether it's for a physical asset, like a new bridge, or just day-to-day expending.
Yes, that's right.
And, I mean, from your point of view, well, it obviously does make a difference because one of them will create more of a return in the longer term, even though I agree it's not a definite fixed economic return. I mean, should we be thinking of these two kinds of debt separately?
So we make a distinction in our economy forecast, and David might want to say a bit about that because it made a material difference to our fiscal forecast this time around, or our economic forecast between public investment and public sector current spending. And so from the point of view of doing an economy forecast, it does make a difference to our view of the potential output of the UK. And we published a paper on this over the summer about the methodology, and then we applied it in practice because there was a big increase in public investment in this budget. But David, do you want to say a bit about how that works?
Yeah, I think if one takes a long horizon, and by which I mean longer than the 5 years that the government is really looking at for its fiscal targets, then I think you do get the benefit of capital investment, you know, the new road, fixing potholes, building a bridge, because we allow for that to increase the productive potential of the UK economy. It creates a bit more GDP. You then get the tax on the extra GDP, and in principle, it could pay for itself. But it's unlike with most kind of particularly infrastructure spending, it's not so likely that it can pay for itself over a 5-year horizon. I mean, to build a new motorway or a bridge could easily take 3 or 4 years to complete. It then has its positive impact on GDP over maybe the next 40 or 50 years. You only get a bit of it back over a 5-year horizon, so it doesn't help too much on the fiscal outlook. And as you say, it kind of doesn't matter very much whether you're borrowing to pay the salaries of public sector workers or to provide public services or to build a bridge when you're just looking at 5 years, which actually will drop to 3 in some sense when the Westminster government's fiscal target becomes where are things 3 years down the road. But we did in this budget analysis look at the positive impacts of bigger capital spending, not just at the end of 5 years where it's kind of meaningful but not particularly large, but if you sustain that, we then provided some estimates of how much extra it would boost the level of GDP if you sustain the higher public sector capital spending that we've got over the next few years. And that builds up and doesn't reach its kind of long-run extra positive impact until you get maybe 20, 25 years down the road. And that's partly because it takes a long time to build stuff, and you announce you're going to spend the money now, but actually you don't start spending it for like 2 years, and then you don't finish the job until 3 years after that. I mean, there's a broader question about whether some elements of public sector spending aren't as productive, if you will, as building the road, the physical infrastructure bit. And you could argue, depends how effectively the money is spent, that spending on education and health, every bit as much boosts the productive potential of the UK economy than building the road or the power station. That then it gets very difficult to measure. A government could argue, well, pretty much everything that we do is like that. So isn't everything that we do investment? Well, I mean, if you took that line and you said, well, it's okay for the government to borrow for investment, there's no restriction whatsoever on borrowing.
Right, you have unpacked that for me, so I appreciate that. I mean, you mentioned this kind of 3 and 5 years thing, and I mean, I was wondering if you had an opinion on that we're going to get this spending review, I think, which is for 3 years, as I understand it, although there's also the 5-year forecast period. I mean, is there a right length of time for these things? I mean, 3 years is actually quite short. Should it be longer, the spending review?
So I think by the time it's completed, our understanding is that the end point of this spending review set of plans will match the end point of the fiscal target. And I think that's a pretty good principle in fiscal policy making, which is that you should have plans that extend as far as your targets extend. I think one of the pretty unsatisfactory situations we've had in the UK for a number of years now has been that the governments have been setting fiscal targets for 2029, but their spending plans up until a few months ago ran out this year. And so an awful lot of those targets were being met by aspirations or kind of stated assumptions about the path of public spending, but they were unsupported by any kind of detailed plan for what that meant for health, education, transport, defence, and all the areas where the government had stated and very expensive priorities. And so I do think that maintaining coherence between what your overall financial objective for the public finances is and where your detailed plans for public spending and indeed for tax end is a good principle. At the moment, we'll get there once the government finishes its next multi-year spending round. The government is also committed to running and made a legal commitment to running spending reviews at greater frequency. So we won't have big gaps emerging. We may still have gaps of 1 or 2 years emerging, but nothing like the 4-year gap that we've had in the recent past between when a spending review period ends and when the fiscal target is supposed to fall due. Okay,
thank you. On another subject, I mean, you've specifically, obviously, the government's talked about the compensation that's going to be given to people who had infected blood and the post office scandal. So they're two quite chunky numbers. But you make the point that defence and overseas aid is unfunded. There's nothing in there for that coming along. So presumably these are, if there was changes to either defence or overseas aid. And I mean, other ones that struck me were, if there was to be expenditure rebuilding Ukraine or Gaza, that would be a kind of one-off that would just kind of hit us. But, I mean, none of that is really taken account of in here, is it?
It's not, in the sense that because beyond the next financial year, the government only for the moment has an envelope set for the spending review, but hasn't spelled out the details for departmental spending plans, which it will do in the next spending review. We can only guess how they will meet all these aspirations. I think what we've said in the EFO is that if these things end up being funded on top of the overall envelope rather than accommodated within them, then they pose kind of anywhere between 10 and 15 billion pounds worth of extra spending pressure on top of the envelope that they've got. And that would be to meet the government's stated aspiration of raising the level of defence spending at some point in future to 2.5% compared to the sort of roughly 2.3% of GDP where it is at the moment, and then also restoring overseas aid back up to 0.7% of GDP, which it hasn't been in this country for a while, kind of since it was cut. Both of those commitments have always been sort of subject to resources being available, but up until now they haven't been available. The government has said that it's going to spell out in more detail what the deadlines for those targets are as part of the next spending round, but we sort of wait to see, and they're expensive commitments.
Right. Okay, thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much, Liz. To be followed by Ross.
Thank you. Behavioural change was mentioned earlier this morning, and obviously that's a key element in deciding on policy. I know you can't comment on the exact policy debate at all. Can I ask you, do you feel that we are getting better able to understand behavioural change when you are examining tax?
I'd say that one. Thank you. So I certainly think that we and HMRC and indeed the SFC have done a lot of work on trying to develop our methodologies for assessing behavioural change. But it does certainly remain an area where there is a significant amount of uncertainty in the estimates. So in this budget in particular, we assessed there would be big behavioural changes in response to the increases in capital taxes that were announced, so capital gains tax, the rate on carried interest and also the changes to inheritance tax. And we think those could come through a number of different channels. People can essentially delay or even actually bring forward asset disposal in response to rate changes. They can shift their holdings between different types of assets. They can use kind of basically tax planning, tax avoidance approaches to avoid or to reduce their liabilities. And in extreme, as I mentioned earlier, people might even choose to leave the country in response to some of those changes. So there's a lot of potential different channels. Estimating how much individual taxpayers will use those channels, as I say, is uncertain. We tend to base our estimates on analysis of the impact of previous similar changes in the past, and there's quite a long history of policy changes in those areas that we can draw on, as well as research from the impact of changes in other countries. But I mean, some of these effects are pretty large. So, for example, for the inheritance tax, I think the capital gains changes, certainly for the carried interest change, you see anywhere from around 50 to almost 90% of the potential yield from the measures being lost due to these behavioural changes.
So are you saying that for some taxes it's a little easier to estimate what the behavioural change might be in comparison with other taxes where it's, economists are often telling us this is incredibly difficult, and I understand why. But are there some taxes where you feel it's a little bit easier to be able to measure that behavioural change?
Yes. So the tax changes I mentioned are ones which fall on quite a small group, relatively, of taxpayers who are typically higher income and maybe more mobile, and therefore and have more channels available to respond to these tax changes. And that's why you see or we estimate a larger response, but as I say, it's uncertain. But then, for example, the increase in employer NICs, which is a much broader-based tax increase, we would assume less direct behavioural response and have a bit more certainty about the kind of direct costing of that. Although, as David has talked about, the sort of wider impacts on the macroeconomy are are complex, and there is quite a lot of uncertainty around the assumptions we made there. But if you like, the sort of direct impact of that tax change is easier to estimate. I
mean, you were hinting earlier, I think, that the changes to marginal propensity to save and consume might change as a result of that. Yeah. Can I also ask, in terms of your work that you undertake with HMRC and also with the Scottish Fiscal Commission, do you notice any behavioural or different behavioural patterns across different parts of the UK in specific taxes, like income tax, for example?
So we, when we were looking at the tax changes that the Westminster government introduced, we did not look at that on a kind of regional basis in terms of assessing behavioural response. We look at it more in terms of kind of taxpayer characteristics in terms of their net wealth, whether they're overseas, the type of assets that they hold. Though, of course, I mean, that will vary across regions, but we don't particularly look at the regional impact of that. When it comes to the Scottish Government policy changes on income tax, then obviously we look specifically at the impact on Scottish taxpayers. I think both us and the SFC made a similar estimate, actually, of the behavioural response to the increase in the higher rates, which reduced the yield by around 50 to 60%. In that case, it's based on people generally choosing to alter the amount of hours they're working in response to the higher rates, or potentially switching their income out of employment and into other forms of income. We did also look at whether there might be a kind of intra-UK migration impact. but the evidence on that is not very clear, basically. There have been some studies which suggest there might be a bit of an impact on migration, but others which found no evidence of an impact. So in our costing, we did not assume there would be any significant or material impact on intra-UK migration as a result of that.
Yeah, I think most businesses would agree that it's very difficult, that you know, there is no sort of trustworthy evidence that people are actually moving away. Where I think there is maybe a little extra evidence is that for some businesses in Scotland are finding it more difficult to attract people to come in the first, as in recruitment is getting increasingly difficult. But as a committee, we're obviously interested in the behavioural change that can impact on people's decisions about how they spend their money, but also when it comes to the labour market issues that we have, and we're talking a lot about economic inactivity, whether that has an effect. And in order to make good judgment on that, it's essential that we try to have as much data as we possibly can, and that is always underlying this committee. So thank you very much for your reflections on that.
Thank you very much. Ross, to be followed by Michael.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning all. To go back to the national insurance contributions and the projections that you made, I think it was 50,000 lost hours in the labour market. I'm just wondering to what extent you take into account potential secondary effects. So one area that I think there's quite acute concern about is the effect in the social care sector. If social care employers struggle to pay these costs, results in a reduction in staff in a sector that already struggles to attract enough staff. That then results in other individuals having to withdraw from the labour market themselves to become unpaid carers to family members. Are those kind of second-order effects taken into account? To what extent are you able to project something like that?
So when we did the assessment of the labour market impact of the tax rise, I think we were cognizant of a number of different changes being introduced on employers at the same time, one of which was the rise in the national living wage, another of which was the rise in national insurance costs, and then looking at the distribution of that impact across different types of employers. And it was evident as soon as you looked at it that if you had employers with a large number of relatively low-paid staff, they were going to have difficulty doing what would be the conventional response, which is to reduce real wage growth, because they had to deliver, they had to protect and in some cases raise wages to reflect the rise in the national living wage. And so the only way that they could afford the national insurance rise would be to reduce employment and to reduce their payrolls that way, rather than just have lower growth in their payrolls over the medium term. And for that reason, and as I think has been borne out by some of the announcements you've seen since the budget, some of the hardest hit sectors are just sectors with very large numbers of relatively low paid people, sort of either at or close to the national living wage. So it's retailers, hospitality, and quite possibly also social care as another industry in that area. I think what we didn't do was then assume some kind of sort of offset in public spending or public services spending, because what we were also seeing alongside that was a very large increase in public spending as a decision of the Westminster government on health and in a whole load of other areas this year and next. And so, while some of that was nominally badged as covering the cost of national insurance, we also just expected it in general just to be increasing the amount of resources available for the provision of those kind of services. So it was hard to know exactly what the sort of one-to-one relationship would be between the increase in payroll costs and then the increase in spending that was going to come their way via the additions to the departmental expenditure envelope.
If the UK government had taken a different approach, but sticking with national insurance contributions and accepting that the primary goal was to raise revenue, if they'd, for example, lifted the 2% cap above on earnings above £50,000, would that have had, albeit that would have raised, I think, half, maybe not quite half of what the employer increase does, but would that have had the same kind of consequences? Because you're saying here the primary impact here is going to be on sectors with large numbers of people on lower incomes, i.e. far less than 50 grand.
It's not something we've looked at, but
I mean, you're right. The distributional impact and which sectors of the economy it would have most impact on would clearly have been different. And sectors of the economy where average wages are much higher, hardly affected. by the national minimum wage and less affected by the NICS measure. So it would have certainly had a different impact than what they did.
Yeah. And switching to a different area entirely, and I'm somewhat flying blind here because I've tried to open so many different versions of your 200-ish page reports from the previous few years that my laptop is now really struggling to cope with it. But on land and buildings transaction tax, your projections there have generally been relatively bullish, and yet they still seem to be increasing and outperforming year on year. But seems to be pretty consistently to the tune of about £1 billion. If I go back to the 2022 LBTT projections versus the projections that are in the most recent report, there's a pretty consistent gap of about £1 billion, and that's replicated if you go back through previous reports as well. So I'm wondering what work you've done looking at the LBTT projections and the methodology behind it, because it seems to be positive that they're outperforming, but it looks like a relatively consistent outperformance.
Yeah, Tom?
Yes, so to produce that forecast, as I was saying earlier, what we do is base it on our UK-wide forecast of the property market, and then look at how much of that revenue raised is raised in Scotland. And I think basically what has happened since 2022 is we've been kind of consistently surprised by the resilience and strength in the property market. And so we have successively had to raise our forecast and have seen outturn come in more strongly than expected. So part of the reason why we were expecting more of or a less strong property market was because of the rise in interest rates and the impact that would have on housing transactions. But the market basically seems to have been sort of more resilient than we and I think most other forecasters expected. So this year, for example, we were expecting prices and transactions to fall, but so far this year we've actually seen prices increase a bit and transactions be stronger than expected. So yeah, I mean that is basically the driver of that trend.
Thanks very much. And sorry, I think I said a minute ago the gap of about £1 billion. The gap for Scotland is pretty consistent, about 100 million. And just finally, go back to Craig's point around public sector pay. One of the challenges that I think both governments have is any figure that's put into a budget for accounting for public sector pay will immediately be taken by trade union negotiators as a floor rather than a ceiling. So there's a tension there between governments being able to put enough money aside to have a genuine negotiation versus the transparency that everybody else requires out of a budget process. Do you have any advice for either government in that regard?
I guess the bit of progress that we've made in this forecast has been to at least get a decent assumption for the pay bill over the next 5 years. And so that's not, and so within that, government's got to make decisions about heads versus pay. But at least what it shows you is if the government plans to crowd out loads of other things it wants to do with the payroll, you can see that. And if the government is trying to maintain some kind of control over that so that it can do other things like invest, like procure things, it can. And so I think that is progress. And then you can fill in more of the details once you know more about what their plans are for spending on the health service education, which then translates more readily into assumptions about numbers of doctors, nurses and teachers. So I think just getting that kind of breakdown of spending by its main economic categories, which is the pay bill, procurement, investment, interest costs, and welfare, I think is progress in terms of understanding the kind of economic composition of public spending. I mean, I can sympathise with governments to not want to telegraph their pay negotiating strategy 5 years ahead. But it's we do have to make when we forecast tax revenues, we do have to make assumptions about what pay growth is in both the public and the private sector because it drives tax liabilities. It would be better to base that on some kind of plan for government rather than having to make it up ourselves.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks. So what you're basically saying there is the UK government will have an envelope for pay, and it will say it can be met either by increased pay, which might mean a reduction in numbers, or it can be lower pay, but maintaining the numbers within that.
The government would describe it as an assumption rather than as a plan, but
Indeed.
It's but at least it's an assumption.
Whereas the Scottish Government will increase numbers and pay beyond that envelope traditionally. Okay, Michael to be followed by Michelle.
Thanks, Convener. First question's another question on this issue about the pay policy. So just a final point of clarity, the UK government did provide you for your forecast this year with a projection on pay for this year within the budget.
So they'd made a set of announcements that they had accepted the pay review body recommendations. So that was what was implied in our forecast. And then they gave us an assumption for the overall pay bill for the years beyond this year, where they hadn't accepted or they haven't got a set of recommendations from the pay review bodies, but they did give us an overall envelope assumption for the pay bill after this year, this financial year.
For context, you may be aware that the Scottish Government has a commitment to provide a pay policy to the Scottish Fiscal Commission, but hasn't failed to do so for the last 2 years in a row. And I think that's part of the reason that there's quite a lot of interest in this issue from the committee. On page 45 of the budget, the Treasury published a graph on the distribution effect of the budget, which showed overall all but the richest 10% of households in the UK will benefit as a percentage of income from policy decisions in 25-26. Do you think that's a significant departure in terms of the distributional effect of this budget in comparison to previous recent budgets?
I think the short answer is it's hard to say because the Treasury changes its methodology for distributional analysis quite a lot. In this particular chart, what they've added in was the sort of benefiting. Traditionally, what they've done is just done tax and benefit changes. So it's a sort of close proxy for the disposable income measure that we would use to measure households, the sort of resources available to an individual household financially. What they've added into this distribution analysis is a sort of an assumption about the benefit in kind that they would get from public services, with the assumption that poorer households get much more of that benefit than richer households, which may be a sort of reasonable assumption, but it's a step away from just a disposable income calculation, which was the old Treasury methodology for doing this, and one which, when we're doing economic forecasting, is more useful in forecasting things like consumption spending and VAT revenues, because it is no doubt good and reassuring to know that you are more likely to be able to access an NHS appointment in a reasonable period of time, but it doesn't affect your disposable income very much for most people in a given year.
Okay. And I suppose in order to realise those benefits, I mean, that's the production of the additional resource that's going to the public services, and I think is it credible to want those benefits without raising taxes?
I mean, not if you're not going to see your debt. Not if you're not going to see your debts rise and rise forever. I mean, governments can't provide more and more public services as a share of the economy and not pay for them without seeing their debts reach an unsustainable level.
Okay, thank you. And you've also said in various parts of the commentary that these investment returns have to be strong in the first couple of years if we're going to get into the kind of growth figures, but also the longer-term benefits in terms of changes. You particularly referenced, I think, in the September report, the issues around, and you've referenced that already, changes in health situations and the impact that can have on our long-term economic performance. I suppose my question in this is the additional money enough, or do we need to see policy change as well in order to actually realise the kind of outcomes?
I think this probably gets into areas that we're not particularly expert in. I suppose when we do our own economic analysis of the economic and fiscal impact of spending on things like education and health, and I guess taking health as the example, which concerns a lot of us at the moment because there are long waiting lists for the health service and big concerns about health-related inactivity. I think one thing that you realise in economic terms is that the biggest long-term economic and fiscal benefits you get are not from treating people who are already sick, because they're oftentimes older, sometimes they're already in the workforce or they're already retired and out of the workforce. The biggest economic and fiscal benefits you get are from keeping people healthier for longer, so that they don't fall ill too early in life, and then end up falling out of the labour force and not coming back. And so you do get significant benefits from keeping the population healthier, but the benefits that you get from an investment now in keeping somebody who's 20 still in the workforce when they're 65, rather than treating somebody who's 65 and already ill, you definitely need to treat that person because you want them to be healthy. It's probably not going to make a very big difference to their labour force decisions because they're either in or out of work at 65 anyway, and the kind of healthcare that you're doing at that stage is probably not going to make a dramatic difference to their employability.
So a shift to preventative intervention.
Yes, and sort of extending healthy working lives. Yes.
But if I may add, the payoff on that is very long term, whereas getting more people to have hip replacements and not wait 9 months and wait 2 months instead has a much more short-term immediate effect, and maybe has an enormous impact on life satisfaction, well-being in the population, but it may do nothing for GDP. Because those people tend to be elderly. They're not going to get back into the workforce. They just suffer less pain.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Commissioner.
Thank you. Michelle.
Thanks for joining us this morning. It's been a very worthwhile session. I just wanted to finish off by getting a reflection on Brexit, which incredibly we've barely discussed this session. And you obviously comment that weak growth and important exports over the medium term partly reflect the continuing impact of Brexit. And from that, you reference trade and decrease in trade intensity, which I think I actually asked about this time last year. But I suppose my observation is the impact on potential or productivity in the light of this being kind of projected as a growth budget. I know you made commentary in March earlier this year, but it would be useful just to get your latest reflections on the specific impact of Brexit on productivity. Obviously, we've got near side, but the longer term, I think you've used a 15-year kind of projection.
I think our assessment remains more or less unchanged from the one we made at the time of the referendum, which is that in the long run, as you said, it's likely to reduce the trade intensity of UK output over 15 years by around 15% compared with having remained in the EU. And then the long-run impact of that on the level of potential output of the UK economy is about 4% once you translate that into what it means for our productive potential. So it in essence makes us a sort of less open economy, and as a result we are slightly less productive as a consequence. What we've seen in the data since 2016 is more or less in line with that assumption, I guess with some important caveats. One is that basically our goods trade seems to be doing worse, but our services trade seems to be doing better than we had anticipated, and that the sort of frictions at the border are making it more difficult to both import and export if you're in manufacturing or in any kind of trade in goods or commodities. Whereas for services, we've actually seen quite significant service export growth and some of the best service export growth in amongst advanced economies. So services industries seem to be finding ways of exporting to the rest of the world, especially in areas like professional services, accounting, finance, consulting, some of which are very important contributors to GDP in Scotland. So those sectors seem to be finding ways of getting around trade barriers, and to some extent being in or out of the EU mattered less for them anyway, because the border for a services industry is a slightly nebulous concept in any case. I mean, that said, there are clearly also risks hanging over the global trade outlook now in the aftermath of the US presidential election, and those could have consequences also for our ability to trade, not necessarily with Europe, but with the US and the rest of the world.
And you've actually just made the point that I was going to come in on next, in the face of the geopolitics, where we're out of the EU, we've got that diminishing trade intensity, we've got activity in the rest. We're President Trump, we've got geopolitics going on. We could end up being in a very isolated place in terms of replacing some of that trade, notwithstanding the comment you make about services.
So it's a significant downside risk to our forecast, which we completed on the 30th of October, so it was before we knew the outcome of the US election. We don't know what the policies of the new US administration are going to be yet. Everyone reads every headline every morning. And we will have to wait to see what gets announced. We did do, as a bit of contingency planning back in the summer of 2022, a sort of global trade war scenario about what a set of sort of worldwide rise in tariff levels would imply for the UK economy, and it is it is negative, and on kind of similar orders of magnitude to those that we looked at in the post-Brexit referendum work. And I should say there's quite a big difference between just the introduction of unilateral tariffs by one country on the rest of the world compared to sort of an outright tariff war where everybody's tariffs go up by 10, 15, 20%, because that has a very big effect on the volume of world trade. One country acting unilaterally, like even the US is a big economy, but it's only sort of 12% of global trade. And it affects principally its individual trading partners, and countries can find ways around those kind of unilateral actions. If it becomes making trading across the world more expensive for everybody, that can have very significant effects on output for any open economy, including one like the UK.
And just returning to your comment about growth and then linking that to capital, I think it was yourself, David, that sort of reminded us that capital will only be about 2.5%. Well, we've got a short-term bounce, if you like, and there's a lot of kind of almost sleight of hand going on here with this budget around the short-term near side. But, you know, longer-term, capital investment still continues to be very low. And I'm interested in how that, you know, the lack of that, how on earth we're going to be able to in any way mitigate the damage of Brexit over the longer term, based on the marginal increases very near side, as we've talked about in this session. How on earth are we going to be able to do that, or if at all?
I think you're right that it's difficult to offset a pretty substantial hit that we have in our forecast from Brexit. It's difficult to offset that in any time over the next 5, even 10 years with higher public sector capital spending as just being the answer, because it would probably have to be a lot higher than we've seen announced in this budget. And that's costly, and the government has to pay for it somehow, and taxes are, you know, the highest level they've been in 70-odd years in the UK. And you start from a position with debt to GDP ratios close to 100%, and the headroom the government's got against its own targets is wafer thin. So it's the old story about you wouldn't want to start from here. But here is where we are. And it may be, as Richard was saying, it may be that trade war across the world will make things worse. I suppose there are some kinds of trade war which could be neutral or even mildly positive for the UK. So if it turned out, who knows, that what we get is a severe bilateral trade war between the US and China, which doesn't directly affect Europe or the UK, it's not inconceivable that that is either neutral or even very mildly positive, in the sense that the US won't be importing as much from China. Well, it's going to be importing stuff from somewhere, and the UK does produce some things, cars are an example, which are substitutes from what would be very expensive imports to the US from China if they put a 60-70% tariff on it. And the Chinese, who sell a lot of stuff to the US, would be looking for markets where they could sell stuff. Well, that might mean slightly cheaper prices of imported Chinese goods, which in itself is not bad for consumers, at least in the UK. So although most of the scenarios for a trade war and all the scenarios which are a global war of every country against other countries is almost certainly a bad news story, a particular kind of trade war, which is just two big countries fighting each other, the US and China, might be neutral or even mildly positive for the UK, which may be too optimistic a note to end on, but...
I was about to say, always look at the bright side, but it doesn't seem terribly bright.
Somewhere there's a bright side.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
That's singing from that wonderful Monty Python film. This morning, the kind of... the embryonic Trump regime said that Mexico, Canada and China will be the target of their tariffs. Just a couple of points to finish off from me. One is regarding the issue which you quite an interesting dialogue with Craig on, and it's the issue of of economic inactivity. It's 26.3% in Scotland and 25.2% as from the UK as a whole. So there's a 1.1% differential. I mean, if you looked at where that is, because one of the things that the SFC has talked about is the fact that people forget that students are included in that. And in Scotland, you do a 4-year university degree, and in England, it's a 3-year university degree. So if 40% of Scottish young people go to university and their working life is reduced from, say, 45 years to 44 years, that is included in economic inactivity, when in fact one could argue that you're actually training for economic activity. So have you broken down that? Because, I mean, the big issue that everyone's concerned about is the people on long-term sickness and incapacity. So is there a breakdown in these figures in terms of where that balance lies?
We have, for the UK as a whole, broken down the rise in inactivity into different groups, and I think early on, I think there was some optimism that the post-pandemic rise was just the delay of people coming into university, and then also a lot of net migration into the UK as a whole came from students. But I think that was a sort of temporary wave, and then those people, you know, in net flow terms, those people then entered the workforce or left the country and went working somewhere else. And the residual group of people who seem to be inactive for health reasons remained high. And so I think certainly in the very initial post-pandemic surge, a big rise in inactivity was students. I think by this point, it does look as though what is left after the kind of bow wave of students has come in and out of university is still higher inactivity for health reasons, being the number one cause for the higher numbers since 2019. And I think in Scotland, because you're a bit more student heavy perhaps than the UK as a whole, that might explain some of the difference in terms of inactivity here. But I think it's also the case that in Scotland, the way in which sort of disability benefits are administered also has an impact on people's ability to sort of financial access to inactive benefits, which we think has also been, as David was saying, an incentive for people to be and remain inactive in the rest of the UK. And the fact that the administration of the benefit system here in Scotland is different from the rest of the UK probably also makes some difference to that differential as well.
Okay, thank you. And just finally, in table 2.1, page 19, you say that from 2019 up to 2028, GDP is expected to rise by cumulative 4.3%, which puts the 4% impact of Brexit into some context. I mean, that just over 4% in 9 years is kind of pitiful, really. I mean, the UK economy appears to be somewhat atherosclerotic, because what you've said in page 168, table A1, is that the world GDP at purchasing power parity has grown, or is expected to grow, from between 3.1% and 3.3% from 2023 onwards, so more than 6 times that of the UK. So what's your perspective on that, and how we can effectively break that kind of cycle of stagnation?
So I suppose there was, this budget in net terms, in the near term, was probably neutral for growth, because it was putting a new burden on employers, but it was also doing more public investment. And over a 5-year horizon, that probably was a wash. As David said, if you took a longer term perspective and looked 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead, the fact that the government is maintaining public investment at that 2.5% of GDP level rather than cutting it back to 1.7, which was the previous government's plan, is probably net positive for the growth potential of the UK, and we certainly assume that's the case in our projections. Looking forward, the government's got a set of other choices that it needs to make about its sort of growth-enhancing policies. It's got a fiscal framework which allows it to do some borrowing for some types of investment in a sort of rule-neutral way. And then it's making another set of regulatory decisions, I think some of which might be positive for growth, like on planning reform, but others might weigh in the other direction. We have yet to see the detail on what they call their making work pay proposals, their sort of plans for increasing employer regulation, which may be another burden on employers when making hiring decisions. So I think there are kind of, looking forward, there are probably risks on either side of our growth forecast, depending on the policy choices available to this government. And then I think also a big question about what the global environment looks like. for international trade in light of what decisions get made in America.
I mean, you said on page 83, in the downside scenario, public and private capital are substitutes, so every additional pound of public investment reduces business investment by 50 pence. The increase in public investment leaves GDP only 0.6% higher in 50 years.
That's right, although that was an assumption in this forecast. We do sort of play different tunes on that assumption depending on exactly where the public investment goes and its relationship to private capital. And David, do you want to say a bit about what difference that
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a bit, and we don't have many details actually about where higher public sector capital spending is going to come. So I think you can think of some kinds of public sector capital spending which clearly advantage and help private sector businesses. So you improve the road network, the rail network, the ability for somebody who's investing in wind farms to link into the national grid. If you do all those things with public sector extra spending, it's pretty clearly a positive for the business sector. On the other hand, some bits of public sector investment might be straight competitors with things that the business sector is producing, and in a sense crowds out a bit of activity. Because we only have a spending review covering next year, we don't really know where the extra public sector capital spending is going to come for most of the 5-year period we cover in our analysis. Even then, it won't be exactly clear what it's going to be spent on. And it's not just what it's spent on, it's also the time lags. I mean, there are some bits of public sector capital spending which have a positive impact, you know, within 48 hours. You fix some terrible potholes in a road.
Shovel ready, they used to call it a few years back.
There's plenty of potholes where I live. I mean, I wish there were shovels turning up. Because you fix it, we could actually drive down the road. On the other hand, you know, building a power station can take 20 years. So, and we don't know, until you know exactly what kind of projects are going to be done, what are they going to spend the money on, and what are the time lags, it's a bit difficult to feel very confident about when you start seeing the benefits.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for your evidence today. It's very much appreciated. Just before we wind up the session, are there any further points that I would like to make to committee? And
no, just to thank you for the opportunity to talk you this morning, and look forward to doing so again in future.
Oh, and it's greatly appreciated that you come up here in person. It makes a big difference to our scrutiny. So thank you very much. That finishes the public part of our committee. So I'll now call a 5-minute break to enable our witnesses, broadcasting and official report to leave.